In our book reading, The History of Romanism from the Earliest Corruptions of Christianity to the Present Time, with full chronological table, indexes, and glossary, and 50 illustrative engravings. This was written by John Dowling, who lived between 1807 and 1878. We are in Book 2, Chapter 5. Origin of Romanist errors continue, worship of saints and relics, etc. The invocation of saints is another of the unscriptural practices of popery, which boast of an origin anterior to the papal supremacy. In modern times, this idolatrous worship of created beings has grown to such a height in the Romanist Church as well nigh to exclude altogether the worship of the Creator. And whoever will take the trouble to examine a popish book of devotion will see that there are many petitions offered to the saints for every one that is offered to the deity. In all probability, this practice grew up by degrees from the honors which in the early ages were paid to the martyrs, and those who in the 3rd or 4th century thus laid the foundation of the system of idolatry little imagined the huge fabric of superstition that would be erected thereon. Perhaps it would be too severe to pronounce an indiscriminate censure upon these early Christians, who, promoted by respect for the virtues of their martyred brethren, were accustomed to assemble among their graves to mourn over their loss and to send up their supplications to the common God and Father of the martyred dead and the suffering living. In process of time, however, the due reverence with which these witnesses for Jesus had been regarded increased to a kind of idolatrous veneration, and religious services performed over their sepulchres were regarded as possessing a peculiar sanctity and virtue. The growth of this idea was so rapid that in the age of Constantine we find that stately churches were, in some instances, erected over their graves, and where this was impracticable, some relic, real or imaginary, of one of these saints were enshrined with all due solemnity in the magnificent buildings erected to their honor. Fleury, the celebrated Roman Catholic ecclesiastical historian, relates that on one occasion in the year 386, Saint Ambrose, being about to consecrate a church at Milan, was prevented by the fact that he had no relics of martyrs to deposit in the altars, when immediately his heart burned within him and presaged as he felt of what was to happen. The historian proceeds to tell us that God revealed to him in a dream the place where the bodies of Saint Gervais and Saint Proteus were to be found. Having discovered their sepulchres, 2 skeletons were discovered of more than ordinary size, all their bones entire, a quantity of blood about, and their heads separated from their bodies. They arranged the bodies, putting every bone into proper place, and they covered them with cloths and laid them on litters. In this manner were they carried towards evening to the Basilica of Saint Fusta, where vigils were celebrated all night, and several that were possessed received imposition of hands. That day and night there was a great concourse of people, and then the old men recollected that they had formerly heard the names of these martyrs, and had read the inscription on their tombs. The next day the relics were transferred to the Basilica Ambrosiana, or Church of St. Ambrose of Milan. So general had the notion become that a church could not be consecrated without relics, that it was decreed by a council at Constantinople that those altars under which no relics were found should be demolished. The same necessity of relics to be deposited in the altar of Romanist churches in order to their due consecration is contended for down to the present day. Are you telling me what? Are you saying if you go into a Catholic church today and underneath their altar is going to be like relics? That's kind of yucky. No matter how minute the particular of supposed holy dust of the saints to whom the church is to be dedicated, a tooth, a toenail, a hair, a drop of blood, or a preserved tear from the eye. Anything will do, so that it has been christened or declared genuine by His infallible holiness, Pope. Upon the arrival of the duly authenticated relic, it is borne in solemn procession by priests in their robes to the altar in which it is to be deposited, and when arrived at its destination, it is placed by the hands of the bishop himself in the place prepared for its reception. The first of the adjoining plates represents the procession of relics to the church, and the other, the bishop in the act of closing up the sacred deposit within the altar. And he's talking about the pictures over here on the book. Before he does this, he marks the sepulchre on the floor, on the four sides, with the sign of the cross. This is the consecration of the sepulchre. He then deposits the relic box with all possible veneration, which must be done bareheaded, the better to testify to the congregation the reverence attached to the ceremony. After this, an anthem is repeated, during which the celebrant, still without his mitre on, incenses the relics, and afterwards puts it on, takes the stone which is to be laid over the sepulchre with his right hand, dips the thumb of the other in chrism, and makes the sign of the cross in the middle of the stone on the side that is to be towards the relics, in order to consecrate it on that side. Anthems and ormus immediately follow according to custom. After this, the celebrant fixes the stone upon the sepulchre, the masons make an end of the work, and the celebrant sanctifies it by the sign of the cross, which is reverently to be made on the stone. To return to the origin of these superstitions, in Egypt, about the 4th and 5th centuries, another method was adopted of showing the reverence of Christians for the mortal relics of departed saints. In that country, according to Gleiser, the Christians began to embalm the bodies of reputed saints and keep them in their houses. The communion with the martyrs being thus associated with the presence of their material remains, these were dug up from the graves and placed in the churches, especially under the altars. And the popular feeling, having now a visible object to excite it, became more extravagant and superstitious than ever. The opinion of the efficacy of the intercession of those who had died a martyr's death was now united with the belief that it was possible to communicate with them directly, necromancy. A belief founded partly on the popular heathen notion that departed souls always lingered around the body they had once inhabited, and partly on the view entertained of the glorified state of the martyrs, a sort of omnipresence being ascribed to them. These notions may be traced to Origen, who and his followers were the first to apostrophize the martyrs in their sermons and besought their intercessions. How crazy. Hold on 1 minute. Okay. But though the orators were somewhat extravagant in this respect, they were far outdone by the poets, who soon took up this theme, and could find no expression strong enough to describe the power and the glory of the martyrs. Christians were now but seldom called upon to address their prayers to God, the usual mode being to pray only to some saint for his intercession. With this worship of the saints were joined many of the customs of the heathen. Men chose their patron saints and dedicated churches to their worship. The heathen, whom the Christians used to reproach with worshiping dead men, found now ample opportunity of retort. Wow. In proportion as men felt the need of such intercession, they strove to increase the number of the intercessors. Martyrs, before unknown, according to the legends of those times, announced themselves in visions, and others revealed the place of their burial, and the populace were disposed to regard every obscure grave as the burial place of a martyr. As specimens of the kind of invocations addressed to the saints in the latter part of the 4th century, we may refer to the funeral orations of the eloquent Gregory Nazianzen upon the martyr Cyprian, bishop of Carthage, and upon his own father. At the close of the former, he addresses a prayer to Saint Cyprian, in which he implores the assistance and protection of the glorified martyr to aid him in the government of his flock. In the latter, he says, I do not doubt that my departed father, being now much nearer to God, does a great deal more for his flock by his intercession than he did on earth by his teaching. The celebrated Roman Catholic historian Dupin, commenting upon this orientation, which was delivered about AD 381, remarks that the Church in the time of St. Gregory Nazianzen believed that the martyrs and saints enjoyed already eternal happiness and the vision of God, that they took care of men upon earth, that they interceded for them, and that it was a very profitable to pray to them for the obtaining of spiritual temporal favors. It should be observed, however, that in that age this idolatrous custom of the Roman Church was but in its incipient state. There is a vast difference between the impassioned addresses of orators and poets to the spirits of the departed martyrs in the age of Gregory and Basil, and the regular liturgical prayers to the saints incorporated into the set forms of devotion in a later generation and perpetuated in their worst forms of idolatry and creature worship down to the present time. It is to be remembered, too, that as yet the anti-Christian abomination of the worship of images had not yet arisen. In the 4th century, says Gleiser, the worship of images was still abominated as a heathen practice. A proof of this is furnished by a secular letter of Epiphanius to John of Jerusalem, written near the close of the century, in which he writes as follows. Having entered into a church in a village of Palestine named Anablatha, I found there a veil which was suspended at the door and painted with a representation, whether of Jesus Christ or of some saint, I do not recollect whose image it was, but seeing that in opposition to the authority of Scripture, there was a human image in the church of Jesus Christ, I tore it in pieces and gave order to those who had care of that church to bury with the corpse the veil. And as they grumbled out some answer that since he was chosen to tear the veil, we might as well find another, I promised them one, and I now discharge that promise. From this letter, we learn not only that the worship, but the use of images in the churches were altogether condemned at this time, as the account given by Mosheim of the progress of this and kindred degrading superstitions from the age of the Nicene Fathers to the establishment of the papal supremacy is so graphic and so true, I shall present the reader with a condensation of his remarks. An enormous train of different superstitions, says he, were gradually substituted in the place of true religion and genuine piety. This odious revolution was owing to a variety of causes: a ridiculous precipitation in receiving new opinions, a preposterous desire of imitating the pagan rites and of blending them with the Christian worship, and that idle prosperity which the generality of mankind had toward a gaudy and ostentatious religion, all contributed to establish the reign of superstition upon the ruins of Christianity. Accordingly, frequent pilgrimages were undertaken to Palestine and to the tombs of the martyrs, as if there alone the sacred principles of virtue and the certain hope of salvation were to be acquired. The reins being once let loose to superstition, which knows no bounds, absurd notions and idle ceremonies multiplied every day. Quantities of dust and the earth brought from Palestine and other places remarkable for their supposed sanctity were handed about as the most powerful remedies against the violence of wicked spirits, and were sold and bought at enormous prices. Kind of reminds me of when I went to Italy, to Rome, boy, was that everywhere, all those little trinkets and stuff. And then on top of the fact that, when I went to Israel, that, what do they do on the tours? They take you around to things such as this, like the sepulcher of Jesus, and, Mount Carmel, and all this others. I mean, it's just really, when you think about, and then on top of that, you think about how many times, or how many, not times, but churches or Christians' homes have these pictures that they say is of Jesus, but they're not. They're not. And they shouldn't even be in the churches, and they really should not be in your home. Because of that, many people, when they think of Jesus or they go to pray and they close their eyes, what do they see? They see that image that was painted, I believe, by Da Vinci of Borgia, who was a very wicked, evil, evil, evil man, who was the bastard son of one of the popes. And that is the image that people bow down to, saying it's Jesus, but it's really not. Oh my God, it's just crazy. But that's what this all reminds me of. Anyway, let me continue. The public processions and supplications by which the pagans endeavored to appease their god, small g, were now adopted into the Christian worship and celebrated with great pomp and magnificence in several places. The virtues that had formerly been ascribed to heathen temples, to their lustrations, to the statues of their gods, small g, and heroes, were now attributed to Christian churches, to holy water, consecrated by certain forms of prayer, and to the images of holy men. And the same privileges that the former enjoyed under the darkness of paganism were conferred upon the latter under the light of the gospel, or rather under that cloud of superstition that was obscuring its glory. It is true that as yet images were not very common, nor were there any statues at all, but it is at the same time and undoubtedly certain, as it is extravagant and monstrous, that the worship of the martyrs were modeled by degrees according to the religious services that were paid to the god, small g, before the coming of Christ. Among other unhappy effects, these superstitious notions opened a wide door to the endless frauds of those odious impostors who were so far destitute of all principle as to enrich themselves by the ignorance and errors of the people. Rumors were artfully spread abroad of prodigies and miracles to be seen in certain places, a trick often practiced by the heathen priests, and the design of these reports was to draw the populace in multitudes to these places and to impose upon their credulity. These stratagems were generally successful, for the ignorance and the slowness of apprehension of people, to whom everything that is new and singular appears miraculous, rendered them easily the dupes of their abominable artifice. Nor was this all. Certain tombs were falsely given out for the sepulchres of saints and confessors. The list of these saints was augmented with fictitious names, and even robbers were converted into martyrs. Some buried the bones of dead men in certain retired places, and then affirmed that they were divinely admonished by a dream that the body of some friend of God lay there. Many, especially of the monks, traveled through the different provinces, and not only sold with the most frontless impudence their fictitious relics, but also deceived the eyes of the multitude with ludicrous combats with evil spirits or genii. That's Genii. These shameful impostures and frauds have indeed been characteristics of popery in all ages. One feature in the inspired description of the man of sin is that his coming should be with signs and lying wonders and all deceivableness of unrighteousness. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, 9 and 10. And all history shows the fidelity of the picture. The popish writers themselves are forced to allow that many, both of their relics and their miracles, have been forged by the craft of priests for the sake of money and lucre. Durantus, a zealous defender of all their ceremonies, gives several instances of the former, particularly of the bones of a common thief, which had for some time been honored with an altar and worshipped under the title of a saint. And for the latter, Lyra, in his comment on Bel and the dragon, observes that sometimes also in the church very great cheats are put upon the people by false miracles contrived or countenanced at least by their priests for some gain and temporal advantage. Of what their own authors confess of some of their miracles, we may venture, without any breach of charity, to believe of them all. Nay, we cannot indeed believe anything else without impiety, and without supposing God to concur in an extraordinary manner to the establishment of fraud, error, and superstition in the world. Several ludicrous but well authenticated instances of these fictitious saints are mentioned by the learned Dr. Conyers Middleton in his letters from Rome. In one of these cases, a mountain has been converted into a saint by the corruption of the name of Mount Socrates near Rome into Socrates. How do you put that? Socrates, Then S. Orsity, or Saint Orsity. This is mentioned also by Addison, who adds that a monastery has been founded in honor of his imaginary saint, of this imaginary saint. This mistake is the less to be wondered at, because the Italians usually write the title of saint with the single letter S, as S. Gregory. And thus, in ages of darkness and ignorance, it was easy to transform Mount Socrates into Saint Oratus. Thus, this holy mountain stands now under the protection of a patron whose being and power is just as imaginary as that of the old guardian Apollo. Wow. Really? Huh. No superstition. I'm sorry, that doesn't say superstition. Hold on 1 minute. I got to take a drink of water. Okay. No suspicion of this kind will appear extravagant to those who are at all acquainted with the history of popery, which abounds with instances of the grossest forgeries, both of saints and relics, which, to the scandal of many, even among themselves, have been imposed for genuine on the poor ignorant people. Even the learned Mabillon, himself a Roman Catholic writer, speaks of some who propagated the feigned histories of newfound saints, and who even sometimes published the inscriptions of pagans for Christians. In the earlier ages of Christianity, the Christians often made free with the sepulchre stones of heathen monuments, which being ready cut to their hands, they converted to their own use, and turning downwards the side on which the old epitaph was engraved, used either to inscribe a new one on the other side, or leave it perhaps without any inscription at all, as they are often found in the catacombs of Rome. Now, this one custom has frequently been the occasion of ascribing martyrdom and saintship to persons and names of mere pagans. Mabillon gives a remarkable instance of it in an old stone found on the grave of a Christian with this inscription. And I can't pronounce that because it's in, what is it, Latin? And because in the same grave there was found likewise a glass vial, or lacrimatory vessel, tinged with reddish color, which they called blood. They regarded this circumstance as a certain proof of martyrdom, and Julia Evodia, though undoubtedly a heathen, was presently adopted both for saint and martyr on the authority of an inscription that appears evidently to have been one of those above mentioned, and borrowed from a heathen sepulchre. But whatever the party there buried might have been, whether heathen or Christian, it is certain that it could not be Evodia herself, but her mother only, as the meaning of the Latin inscription is, that the daughter Julia Evodia raised this stone to her mother. The same author mentions some original papers which he found in the Barbarine library, giving a pleasant account of a negotiation between the Spaniards and Pope Urban VIII in relation to a certain Saint Viar. The Spaniards, it seems, have a saint held in great reverence in some parts of Spain called Viar, V-I-A-R, for the farther encouragement of whose worship they solicited the Pope to grant some special indulgences to his altars, and upon the Pope's desiring to be better acquainted first with his character and the proofs which they had of his saintship, they produced a stone with these antique letters S. Viar, V-I-A-R, which the antiquaries readily saw to be a fragment of some Roman inscription in memory of one who had been Proficus as Viarum, or overseer over all the highways. But we have in England an instance still more ridiculous of a fictitious sainthood, in the case of a certain saint called Amphibolis. who, according to our monkish historians, was bishop of the Isle of Man and fell martyr and disciple of Saint Alban. Yet the learned Archbishop Usher has given us good reasons to convince us that he owes the honor of his sainthood to a mistaken passage in the old Acts or legends of Saint Alban, where the Amphibolus mentioned and since reverenced as a saint and martyr was nothing more than the cloak which Alban happened to have at the time of his execution, being a word derived from the Greek and signifying a rough, shaggy cloak, such as was worn by the monks in that age. Thus we see that the Romans can boast not only of a Saint Mount Orcate, but also of a Saint Cloak. I'm sorry. Amphibolus. But this is not the climax of Rome's worse than pagan idolatry. They have not only a saint cloak, but also a saint handkerchief, to which they actually address prayers. They pretend to show at Rome, says Dr. Middleton, two original impressions of the Savior, of our Savior's face, on two different handkerchiefs. The one sent a present by himself to Agbaras, prince of Edessa, who by letter had desired a picture of him, the other given by him at the time of his execution to a saint or holy woman, Veronica, upon a handkerchief which she had lent him to wipe his face on that occasion, both which handkerchiefs are preserved, as they affirm, and now kept with the utmost reverence. The first in St. Sylvester's Church, the second in St. Peter's, where, in honor of this sacred relic, there is a fine altar built by Pope Urban VIII with a statue of Veronica herself with the following inscription. And I can't read that because it's in Latin. I don't think I can. It says, Salvatoris Imaginem Veronix Point Max, or maybe Pontifex Maximus. I'm not sure what that means. I don't know. But notwithstanding the authority of Pope Urban and his inscription, this Veronica, as Mababilian, one of their own best authors, has shown, like Amphibolus before mentioned, was not any real person, but the name given to the picture itself by old writers who mention it, being formed by blundering and confounding the words Vera Icon. Oh, Vera Icon. Vera, and then Icon. Latin for a true image. The title inscribed perhaps or given originally to the handkerchief by the first contrivers of the imposture. It is related by Bauer, upon the authority of Mabillon, that Pope Innocent III composed a prayer in honor of this image and granted a 10 days indulgence to all who should visit it, and that Pope John the 22nd, more generous than Innocent, vouchsafed no less than 10,000 days indulgences to every repetition of the following blasphemous prayer. Hail, holy face of our Redeemer, printed upon a cloth as white as snow. Purge us from all spot of vice and join us to the company of the blessed. Bring us to our country, O happy figure, there to see the pure face of Christ. That is horrible. It is possible for impious idolatry to go beyond this, and yet this prayer to the holy handkerchief, says Middleton, is inserted in the popish books of offices and ordered by the rubric to be addressed to it, and this absurd legend and others like it, fabulous and childish as they appear to men of sense, are urged by grave authors in defense of their image worship as certain proofs of its divine origin, and sufficient to confound all the impious impostors of it. That reminds me so much of the Passion of the Christ. And, you know, how Christians like, oh, it's such a good movie. Oh, my God, it's just wonderful. Oh, yeah, oh. No, 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 no. There's a scene there with Veronica, you know, as Jesus was going and he fell down with the cross and stuff, that she runs over and wipes his face. That's what they're talking about. I wish people would understand this. That movie is not from God. It's not. And it is not the Gospels. It's not. It's lies mixed in with some facts, some truth, but it's the majority lies, and people don't get it. People don't understand it. It's really upsetting to me. It just upsets me. Forgive me. I'm going to get off my little soapbox. It does make me mad, though. Okay, to return to the origin of these lying wonders, Mosheim remarks that the interests of virtue and true religion suffered grievously by two monstrous errors which were almost universally adopted in the 4th century and became a source of innumerable calamities and mischiefs in the succeeding ages. The first of these maxims was that it was an act of virtue to deceive and lie, when by that means the interests of the church might be promoted. And the second, equally horrible, though in another point of view, was that errors in religion, when maintained and adhered to after proper admonition, were punishable with civil penalties and corporal tortures. The former of these erroneous maxims was now of a long standing. It had been adopted for some ages past and had produced an incredible number of ridiculous fables, fictitious prodigies, and pious frauds, to the unspeakable deterrent of that glorious case in which they were employed. The other maximum, relating to the justice and expediency of punishing error, was introduced with those serene and peaceful times which the accession of Constantine to the imperial throne procured to the church. It is from that period approved by many, enforced by several examples during the contest that arose with the Priscillinians and Donatists, confirmed and established by authority of Augustine, and thus transmitted to the following ages. In relation to the 5th century, the same historian remarks, it before this time, the luster of religion was clouded with superstition, and its divine precepts adulterated with a mixture of human inventions. This evil, instead of diminishing, increased daily. The happy souls of devoted Christians were invoked by numbers, and their aid implored by auspicious and fervent prayers, while none stood up to censure or oppose this preposterous worship. The question, how the prayers of mortals ascended to the celestial spirits, a question which afterward produced much wrangling and many idle fantasies, did not as yet occasion any difficulty. For the Christians of this century did not imagine that the souls of the saints were so entirely confined to the celestial mansions as to be derived of the privilege of visiting mortals and traveling when they pleased through various countries. They were further of opinion that the places most frequented by departed spirits were those where the bodies they had formerly animated were interred. And this opinion, which the Christians borrowed from the Greeks and Romans, rendered the sepulchres of the saints and general rendezvous of supplicant multitudes. A singular and irresistible efficacy was also attributed to the bones of martyrs and to the figure of the cross in defeating the attempts of Satan, removing all sorts of calamities, and in healing not only the diseases of the body, but also of the mind. We shall not enter here into a particular account of the public supplications, the holy pilgrimages, the superstitious services paid to departed souls, the multiplication of temples, altars, penitential garments, and a multitude of their circumstances that showed the decline of genuine piety and the corrupt darkness that was eclipsing the luster of primitive Christianity. As there were none in these times to hinder the Christians from retaining the opinions of their pagan ancestors concerning departed souls, heroes, demons, temples, and such like matters, and even transferring them into their religious services, and as, instead of entirely abolishing the rites and institution of ancient times, these institutions were still observed with only some slight alterations. All this swelled of necessity the torrent of superstition and deformed the beauty of Christian religion and the worship with those corrupt remains of paganism which still subsist in the Romanist church. In the 6th century, the public teachers seemed to aim at nothing else than to sink the multitude into the most opprobrious ignorance and superstition, to efface in their minds all sense of the beauty and excellence of genuine piety, and to substitute in the place of religious principles a blind veneration for the clergy and a stupid zeal for a senseless round of ridiculous rites and ceremonies. This, perhaps, will appear less surprising when we consider that the blind lead the blind. For the public ministers and the teachers of religion were, for the most part, grossly ignorant, yea, almost as much as the multitude whom they were appointed to instruct. To be convinced of the truth of the dismal representation we have here given of the state of religion at this time, nothing more is necessary than to cast an eye upon the doctrines now taught concerning the worship of images and the saints, the fire of purgatory, the efficacy of good works, i.e., the observance of human rights and institutions toward the attainment of salvation, the power of relics to heal the diseases of body and mind, and such like sordid and miserable fancies which are inculcated in many of the superstitious productions of this century, and particularly in the epistles of other writings of Gregory the Great. Nothing more ridiculous on one hand than the solemnity and liberality with which the superstitious pontiff distributed the wonder-working relics, and nothing more lamentable on the other than the stupid eagerness and devotion with which the deluded multitude received them, and suffered themselves to be persuaded that a portion of stinking oil taken from the lamps which burned at the tombs of the martyrs, or the filings of a chain supposed to have been worn by a saint, had a supernatural efficacy to sanctify their possessors and to defend them from all dangers, both of temporal and spiritual nature. That is crazy. There was an incredible number of temples erected in honor of the saints during the 6th century, both in the eastern and western provinces. The places set apart for public worship were already very numerous, but it was now that Christians first began to consider these sacred edifices as a means of purchasing the favor and protection of the saints, and to be persuaded that these departed spirits defended and guarded against evils and calamities of every kind the provinces, lands, cities, and villages in which they were honored with temples. The number of these temples was almost equaled by that of the festivals which were now observed in the Christian church, and many of which seem to have been instituted upon a pagan model. In order to show that the charge above referred to in relation to Gregory's superstitious regard to relics is not made without sufficient reason, I will present the reader with a translation of an epistle which he wrote to the Empress Constantina, who was building a church at Constantinople in honor of St. Paul, and had written to Gregory to grant her either the head or some other part of the body of that apostle, which was said to be at Rome, for the purpose of enshrining it in the church when completed. After a respectful allusion to the request of the empress, Gregory proceeds. Great sadness hath possessed me, because you have enjoined upon me those things which I neither can or dare do, for the bodies of the holy apostles, Peter and Paul, are so resplendent with miracles and terrific prodigies in their own churches that no one can approach them without great awe, even for the purpose of adoring them. When my predecessor of happy memory wished to change some silver ornament which was placed over the most holy body of St. Peter, though at the distance of almost 15 feet, a warning of no small terror appeared to him. Even I myself wished to make some alterations near the most holy body of St. Paul, and it was necessary to dig rather deeply near his tomb. The superior of the place found some bones which were not at all connected with that tomb, and having presumed to disturb and remove them to some other place, he was visited by certain fearful apparitions and died suddenly. My predecessor of holy memory also undertook to make some repairs near the tomb of St. Lawrence. As they were digging, without knowing precisely where the venerable body was placed, they happened to open his sepulchre. The monks and guardians who were at the work, only because they had seen the body of that martyr, though they did not presume so much as to touch it, all died within 10 days, to the end that no man might remain in life who had beheld the body of that just man. Be it then known to you that it is the custom of the Romans, when they give any relic, not to venture to touch any portion of the body, only they put into a box a piece of linen called brandium, which is placed near the holy bodies. Then it is withdrawn and shut up with due veneration in the church which is to be dedicated, and as many prodigies are then wrought by it as if the bodies themselves had been carried thither. Whence it happened, then in the time of St. Leo, as we learn from our ancestors, When some Greeks doubted the virtue of such relics, that pope called for a pair of scissors and cut the linen, and blood flowed from the incision. And not at Rome only, but throughout the whole of the West, it is held sacrilegious to touch the bodies of saints, nor does. Hold on. Sacrilegious to touch the bodies of the saints, nor does. I don't know what that's saying to me. Temerity ever remain unpunished, and it's Temerity. I don't know what that word is. For which reason we are much astonished at the custom of the Greeks to take away the bones of the saints, and we scarcely gave credit to it. But what shall I say respecting the bodies of the holy apostles, when it is a known fact that at the time of their martyrdom a number of the faithful came from the east to claim them? But when they had carried them out of the city to the second milestone, to a place called the Catacombs, the whole multitude was unable to move them farther. Such a tempest of thunder and lightning terrified and dispersed them. The napkin, too, which you wish to be sent at the same time, is with the body and cannot be touched more than the body can be approached. But that your religious desires may not be wholly frustrated, I will hasten to send to you some part of those chains which St. Paul wore on his neck and hands, if indeed I shall succeed in getting off any filings from them. For since many continually solicit as a blessing that they may carry off from those chains some small portion of their filings, a priest stands by with a file. And sometimes it happens that some portions fall off from the chains instantly and without delay, while at other times the file is long drawn over the chains, and yet nothing is at last scraped off from them. That is crazy, you guys. That is absolutely insane. Besides the superstitious and idolatrous reverence of Gregory for relics, he labored hard in exalting the merit of pilgrimages to holy places, encouraged the use, though he condemned the worship of images in the churches, introduced a more imposing method of administering the communion with a magnificent assemblage of pompous ceremonies, which institutions was called the canon of the Mass, and which without doubt tended a century or two later to the conception of the absurd doctrine of transubstantiation. He also seriously inculcated a belief in the pagan doctrine concerning the purification of departed souls by a certain kind of fire, which he called purgatory, and which doctrine, as Gleiser asserts, was first suggested by Augustine, the bishop of Hippo, towards the close of the 4th century. A doctrine, this, which, conjoined with the opinion afterwards invented of the efficacy of masses in delivering tormented souls from these fires, and the power of Pope to grant indulgences, exempting the purchasers from a portion or from the whole of their merited period of suffering in them, was the origin of an almost inexhaustible source of wealth to the Pope and the clergy, extorted from the credulity and the fears alike of the rich and the poor through long ages of superstition and night. From the review which we have thus taken of the origin and progress of these various corruptions of Christianity, it appears that the exception of the belief in transubstantiation, the general worship of images, the practice of auricular confession, the performance of worship in an unknown tongue, and a few minor particulars, there is but little difference between the characteristic features of popery at its birth in the 7th century and the popery in its dotage in the 19th. It is true that as age after age rolled away and old corruptions were strengthened and new ones added to the list, as the man of sin in the course of a few centuries trampled upon the thrones of monarchs, unsheathed the sword of persecution against the suffering martyrs of Jesus, and reeled onward in the career of ages, drunk with the blood of the saints, and the title of Antichrist became more deeply branded on his shameless front. And yet it is equally true that popery at its birth in 606 was characterized by every one of the predicted marks of the great apostasy, as truly as it bears those marks at the present day. Then, as now, the apostate Church of Rome had departed from the faith, giving heed to seducing spirits and doctrines of devils, speaking lies in hypocrisy, having their conscience seared with a hot iron, forbidding to marry, and commanding to abstain from meats. 1 Timothy chapter 4, 1 and 2. Then, as now, that man of sin was revealed, even the son of perdition, who opposeth and exalteth himself above all that is called God, that is worshipped, so that he, as God, sitteth in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. And his coming was after the working of Satan with all power and signs and lying wonders. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 3, verse 4, verse 9, and 10. And that completes our reading from the history of Romanism. I will pick up later. God bless you all. Keep your eyes on Jesus, brothers and sisters. I'm telling you, there's such just great deception everywhere. There really is. And your nose in the book, which is the Word of God. And embed the Word of God upon the tablets of your hearts, so you and I will not sin against God or be deceived. Bye-bye.